Welcome back to Good Day Columbia. Time now is 8:40. 11 years ago today, an unspeakable tragedy in Charleston took place that forever changed the landscape of our nation. Convicted church shooter Dylan Roof murdered 9 people at Mother Emanuel AME. The victims were all taking part in a Bible study when authorities say Roof just opened fire, killing them. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was one of the people murdered at the hands of Roof. This morning, his granddaughter, Alana Grant, joins us to talk about his legacy. Good morning, Ms. Grant.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you for the invitation.
Definitely, and we had to call you and bring you in. You know, you have been very vocal from the beginning when this situation happened, this tragedy. You started the organization Hate Won't Win, and that took the world by storm, quite frankly. Let's get to you for just a second. It's been 11 years now. Where are you in your journey as it relates to dealing with the murder of your grandfather?
I'm glad that you used the word journey because I think it's important for people to understand, and it was something that I had to learn, that healing and progress aren't linear. And so in this journey, I will say as an individual, part of my healing journey has been accepting just that it's not a linear journey, and that there are some days where I can be really grateful for the time that I've experienced with my grandfather and for the things that have happened in my life since then. Mm-hmm. And then there's other days where I remember him less as the symbol that we kind of talk about annually and more as the human. And that part really does grieve me because I see my grandfather as a father, as a grandfather, an uncle, a cousin, and I kind of zoom out from his death and think about his life and how he lived. And for not just my grandfather, but the victims and survivors, I think sometimes we lose the plot in remembering that there were children present. I think sometimes we lose the plot in remembering that there were young adults and that there were elderly people there who lost their lives and that they meant something to a lot of the people in their lives and in their community.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Honestly, when you think about that, you think about the young children and the trauma, especially those who survived it, having to go through that. Who was Reverend Daniel Simmons?
Well, it's interesting because I learned a lot about my grandfather after he passed away.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I knew him from our personal relationship.
Granddad.
Yes,
exactly.
He was my granddad. He had a lot of directions, let's just say, for his grandchildren and children. And then after he passed, I learned so much more about him, which is why I'm glad that my aunt, his daughter, decided to do a documentary about his life recently.
And speaking about that documentary, actually, we have some information. It's actually going to be shown tonight at Allen University, and it's going to be shown at 6 p.m. at Allen University. That's definitely something. There it is. It's called One Last Breath. It's going to be at Allen at 6 p.m. tonight, so folks can be able to know more about your grandfather, one of the victims there. What memory stands out the most to you with your granddad?
Our last conversation, our last conversation over the phone. I was preparing to buy a house. I'm a native of Virginia, and he was encouraging me to buy a house in South Carolina. And I had only come to South Carolina to visit him or my grandmother. I had never spent an extensive amount of time here, and I thought it was the wildest thing for him to say to me to come move to South Carolina because I didn't know anything about the state. And so after he passed, that really stuck with me because I did end up moving to South Carolina and making this state my home. And it was kind of a God wink to me.
One of the elephants in the room when we talk about what happened in Mother Emanuel is a hate crime law.
Yes.
South Carolina is still one of 2 states who don't have it. It's been named after Senator Clementa Pinckney, but it's been stalled in the State House. Senator Clementa Pinckney, one of the individuals who was murdered. Why do you believe after this massacre, we still don't have a hate crime law?
I think that goes back to my earlier point about progress not being linear. You have to just remember, or just to give the viewers some context, like the same State House that decided to bring down the Confederate flag as a political gesture after the murder there were thousands of people there to celebrate the taking down of the Confederate flag, and on the opposite side of the State House, there were hundreds of Ku Klux Klan members opposing it. And so it really does kind of, if you can zoom out a little bit, it gives you the context of what is important to most people and then what is important to some people. And for me, and part of what I did with the Hate Won't Win movement was inspiring people to be bold enough to talk about this elephant in the room, if you will, and reminding them that racism is not something that is ancient history, that it is a current event for a lot of people who experience it. And Mother Emanuel, people talk about how Dylan Roof was, you know, a lone wolf, and that this was an isolated incident. But in my experiences, particularly after this event, I saw a lot of lone wolves, and most of them were encouraged by words, not by their own experiences, not by people, by words that they saw on the internet and words that they heard from other little corners of the world. And so I think it's important for us to remember that our words are just as important as our gestures, and that our deeds are just as important as our words. And so with the hate crime legislation not being passed out of the legislative body, to me, it is personally hurtful, but it is also, let me think of the best word to use here. It is also, I would say, egregious at this moment, because particularly Senator Pinckney, it being his body that is holding it up. That to me says that some of the people who are not on board with this lack courage, and they lack the conviction that it takes to keep progress going.
Alana Grant, thank you so much for being here and sharing the legacy of your grandfather and also those words. We appreciate that. And speaking of the hate crime law, it's a question we turn into a special here at Watch Fox. It's called Folded Not Forgotten, Hate Crime Law in South Carolina, where we look into the Senator Clementa Pinckney hate crime law that has stalled repeatedly. You can watch that special on our YouTube page on Watch Fox, and for more details about that. We're back after this.